Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show of a very special guest. Comes to us from Toronto, Canada. His name is Richard Syrett. His last name is spelled Syrett. And he's just published a book. I read through it today. If you're watching this on YouTube, Rumble, X, Substack, you'll see the book cover, very interesting book cover. And the title is Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. And you can get it. It's actually going to be available tomorrow. The full title is Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, Eerie Enigmas and Supernatural Secrets from Rock's Darkest Corner. So this is a great looking book and it has a lot of information I haven't read about in the past. And it will be available tomorrow on Amazon. And Richard Syrett is not just an author. He's also, I've listened to him as a podcast host or a streaming host on his show, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. He's been doing that in the Toronto airwaves for three decades. And he's earned a reputation as one of Canada's most compelling interviewers in the realm of the unexplained. He's a master storyteller with a broadcaster's discipline. He's built a career exploring the strange, the forbidden, and the questions others are afraid to ask. And you'll see some of the people that he's read and who he's noted in the book are people who've been on my show. You'll see that once we kind of get into this. He's also a regular guest host on Coast to Coast AM, the most listened to late night radio program. And again, he is the creator and host of critically acclaimed podcast, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. And his television series, The Conspiracy Show, aired internationally for 5 seasons across Canada, Australia, Europe, and Africa. He's a sought after authority on high strangeness. So he's like an ideal fit for my show. And he's also appeared on many television programs, including William Shatner's Weird or What, National Park Mysteries, Freak Encounters, and Gaia TV's Forbidden Technology. And again, he is headquartered in Toronto. And again, today we're going to talk about this book, Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, just published. So, Richard Syrett, welcome to the show.
William, great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Excellent. So, for people who are not familiar with you, haven't heard you on your podcast or on Coast to Coast, maybe you can just do an overview of your career and then the research that led up to the publication of this book.
I guess an over 30,000 foot view of my career would look like a quilt, kind of a patch quilt. Started in terrestrial radio in the early 90s, behind the scenes as a producer, what we used to call a chase producer for current affairs. So I would, track down the guests and research the topics. And I was also the call screener for those old enough to remember the TV show Frasier. I was Roz, the male version of Roz, screening the calls. So that was sort of my entree into talk radio. I thought originally I was going to get into documentary television, and this was just kind of I'll do this until something better comes along. But I fell in love with the medium, talk radio, and the immediacy of live radio. I got my own show in 2000, and it didn't start out as, sort of high strangeness. It just evolved into that. And then after 9/11, that I became consumed by that. And I, not in my nature to boast, but I probably was one of the first broadcasters in mainstream radio or mainstream media for that matter, at least in Canada, who was, sort of pulling on those threads around 9/11, like within days. What do you mean a pristine passport was found at the foot of the World Trade Center building that belonged to one of the hijackers? That doesn't make sense. And from there, I sort of took my bag of tricks to various radio stations up and down the dial in Toronto. I've been very fortunate. I've always worked in major market radio. And the Conspiracy Show started out as a radio show. Within a couple of years, it became a television show. So I was doing both the radio and TV. And then in, 2018, I created, produced, wrote, and narrated a podcast. It was kind of documentary style. It was called The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. And I produced 40 episodes. And that podcast really forms the basis and the inspiration for this book, Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. I chose 16 out of the 40 episodes and transcribed the actual episodes, and then preserved the quotes and a lot of the information from the great experts and journalists and musicians and so forth that were in the podcast. They're in the book, but I rewrote the narration and kind of beefed it up and gave it more of a kind of a literary or cinematic even feel. So that's really my career in a nutshell, and someone might say in a nutshell indeed. And that's basically how the book came together as well.
Right. So it's like a mix on the Twilight Zone. And there is just high strangeness all over the rock and roll
Mm,
world. Like there's so many mysterious deaths, so many strange happenings and all that stuff. So it's a rich mine or vein to mine, so to speak, right?
for sure, for sure. And that's, people often ask me, since I've been promoting the book, why is that? Why is rock, uh, you know, such a rich vein to be mined? And to me, rock and roll is one of the great American cultural contributions, along with blues and along with cinema and jazz and so forth. But the birth of rock and roll, what is that? What did they used to say? The blues got together with jazz, and they had a baby, and they called it rock and roll. But it's such a kind of a coalescing of so many different cultures. You had Appalachia, and you had Cajun culture, and you had the Delta blues, and you had rhythm and blues and gospel and Negro spirituals and all of the um, sort of the cultures that sort of came together in this amazing stew, if you will. And so, how could you not, given this intersection or collision, if you will, of all these different cultures with their myths and legends, how could you not have this amazing, um, amazing mix of with legends and mysteries and the unexplained. It's the whole package. It really is.
It really is. And American rock and roll is like almost like world culture now, but it all goes back. Like if you talk to a lot of people or a lot of musicians and guitar players, it all starts with a African American guy in the Delta, right? Named
Mhm.
Robert Johnson. Some people aren't familiar with his name, but maybe that's a good place to start is the mystery of him.
It is. It's not rock and roll necessarily, but some people refer to Robert Johnson as maybe the godfather or the grandfather, the great grandfather of rock and roll. We're talking about the 1930s. He was a sharecropper or the son of a sharecropper, and in Mississippi. And for someone like Robert Johnson, there weren't too many tickets out of that life, which was primarily one of misery, and one was to become a bluesman, to learn the Delta blues guitar and play gin joints all over the deep South. That could be, a wonderful escape from that lifestyle, and so that's what he wanted. But Robert Johnson, by all accounts, was to be kind, let's say, incredibly mediocre at his craft. And he used to hang around some pretty established bluesmen, but one in particular by the name of Son House. And he tried to pick up, fingerings and chords and different things, but quite frankly, he just didn't have it. And at a certain point, I think he became a bit of an annoyance to these blues legends, really, Son House, and he got kind of chased away eventually, and he disappeared for about a year. And a year later, according to the legend, and history, legend, the lines are kind of blurred here, but according to the legend, Son House and his band are playing at a gin joint. They go out into the parking lot for a smoke break in between sets, and while they're out there, somebody has jumped up on stage, kind of an open mic night, if you will, and they hear the most incredible blues riffs and picking that they've ever heard, and they rush into the gin joint, and there on the stage is this figure who's he's got his back to the audience and he's kind of hunched over his guitar. And occasionally he'll turn around and the stage light will catch his eyes and they're this strange white, glowing white. It was Robert Johnson. It was Robert Johnson, this scrawny kid who they chased out of their circle a year earlier. And here he is on the stage and the audience is absolutely enthralled. And it was said that he was turning his back to the audience and hiding these secret fingerings and chords and things that he had learned. Now, according to the legend, now Robert Johnson never said this, he never denied it. Son House believed this was the case, that Robert Johnson, on a moonless night, met at a crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and met the legendary figure we know as the devil. Down in the Deep South, they referred to him as Old Scratch. And according to the legend, you turn your back at the crossroads, and Old Scratch, you hand your guitar over your left shoulder, and Old Scratch performs a particular tuning on the guitar. You make your deal, you make your pact that you will sell your soul, and he will give you fame and fortune for a limited time only. And that's how Robert Johnson became this master bluesman. It was also said that he rehearsed and took lessons from the devil in the local cemeteries around Clarksdale. And this is how he became the legendary bluesman, Delta bluesman, Robert Johnson. And again, he never said that this is what happened. He never denied it. And he also incorporated some of these stories into his songs. Of course, Hellhounds on My Trail and so forth. And The Crossroads, which inspired Eric Clapton and so many others. Leonard Skinner. So many performed that song. Some of those artists thought that song was cursed. And at a certain point, I guess the contract ran out and Robert Johnson committed kind of a rookie mistake. He went into a bar one night and he was kind of a notorious ladies' man. There were a lot of jealous husbands and boyfriends that were very angry at Robert Johnson. He went into a gin joint. He made a rookie mistake. He accepted a drink from an open bottle. And whether that bottle was laced with strychnine or arsenic, we're not really sure. But Robert Johnson died on his knees, howling like a hellhound. It took him many, many hours, something like half a day, to finally expire. But it was a very painful and horrible death. So that's the legend of the Crossroads and Robert Johnson.
It's an incredible story, and these motifs will permeate rock and roll forever. Early death, poisoning, pact, great genius. One of the interesting things about Johnson is I don't think he was recorded very much. We don't have that many of his songs. I mean, I think there was only one recording, and they are the eeriest, strangest, most unique songs. He had something special. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, he did. You're right. There may be 2 or 3 at best, but you're right. Not a lot of recordings exist. Whether some of them were destroyed, I'm not sure. But the remarkable thing again is I go back to this, 1 year he was at best mediocre. And again, that's being very kind. And then a year later, he is this, master Delta bluesman. Is it possible? I suppose. Is it probable? No. So what happened there? That's, the big question. And I should, if I can make a quick aside here, because this is, people talk about the curse of the crossroads, and this idea of the crossroads goes way back, even to ancient Greece. They would often bury, getting into the medieval times, they would bury people that were convicted of being witches at a crossroads. They couldn't be buried on hallowed ground, so they bury them in the crossroads. But it's a very old legend. But over the years, I've done a number of radio programs and podcasts about this very subject, and I hope I don't, cause anything untoward to happen on this broadcast or this stream, because on a number of occasions, one I was interviewing a gentleman who's in that chapter in the book, Matt Swain, who's written about rock and roll ghosts and the ghosts of country music. Anyway, I had him on that particular podcast episode that inspired the chapter. And this was on another occasion, and I was recording for a podcast, and we did like an hour on Robert Johnson, and it sounded great. The audio was great. I guess I made a rookie mistake. I didn't check the recording before I, hung up the phone. In those days, I did it over the phone using like a phone coupler, and then it went into my Adobe Audition or something. Anyway, so I hung up the phone with Matt Swain, and I listened. I went to listen back, and the entire hour was just garbled. It wasn't like distortion. It wasn't like I had the levels up too high. It was just, I wouldn't say like it was playing backwards, maybe backwards and flipped on its side. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever heard the entire 60 minutes. So eventually we had to re-record that. Another time I was doing the same topic with a different guest, I think, on Coast to Coast AM. And at that time, I was not doing the Coast to Coast from this studio. I was doing it from the local Toronto affiliate, CFRB. And we were right in the midst of talking about the curse of the Crossroads and Robert Johnson. And back in LA, where Coast to Coast emanates from, Sherman Oaks, California, their studio, and in fact, the whole building where the studio was, the internet went down. And so I was kicked off the air for like an hour. It happened a third time. When I was doing a local Toronto radio station. It was called The Conspiracy Show. And it was with my late partner and collaborator, R. Gary Patterson, who was a noted rock historian. We used to call him the Fox Mulder of rock. His fingerprints are all over this book. They're all over the podcast. It was supposed to be a terrestrial radio show before it was a podcast, but he died unexpectedly back in May of 2017. Anyway, one of the last conversations I had with Gary on the radio, same thing. We were going to talk about his visit to the Crossroads, and this story makes it into the book. And I could hear him, but he couldn't hear me at one point, and at another point, I could hear him, but he could hear me, but I couldn't hear him. Anyway, it was crazy. So it's got quite a track record. The curse of the Crossroads.
That's the Eerie Enigma. And you can go to Clarksdale, and there's actually kind of a statue or some type of memorial showing that where the Crossroads is there. So I know you can do that. It's upstate Mississippi, but arguably Robert Johnson is the founder of the Delta Blues. I don't know if that's really true. He's certainly one of the most influential. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess because he was sort of he was following in the footsteps of guys like Son House, but I guess Robert Johnson kind of eventually overshadowed all of those people. So yeah, certainly I guess would be called the king of the Delta Blues. But then of course, we had, people like Muddy Waters, but Robert Johnson, it started with him. And the interesting thing is, even though it wasn't rock and roll, he was 27 when he passed. So he was kind of the inaugural member of the 27 Club. But nobody knew about the 27 Club. There wasn't a pattern of musical artists dying at the age of 27 really until, I guess, 69 with Brian Jones. And then the following year, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, all 27. And then the following year, Jim Morrison, 4 in a row of the, 4 giants from classic rock, all aged 27. But Robert Johnson, people forget, was 27.
It's absolutely incredible stuff. And all this stuff is there because I think Robert Johnson was, and there are similarities between Brian Jones and Robert Johnson in that they kind of took instruments and played them in an eerie, enigmatic way. Wow. Would you agree with that?
Well, I know that one of the things that is notable of Brian Jones is that it is said, could pick up a guitar and master it in a couple of hours. He would pick up a sitar, for example. A lot of people credit George Harrison with introducing the sitar into popular music. Maybe that's true. I'm not sure of the timing, but I know Brian Jones was also interested in the sitar and introduced it into some of the early Stones recordings. But he had that ability. Brian Jones also, was quite a ladies' man. In fact, I think he sired several illegitimate children before he was 19. So he was a bit of a, what is the expression the British use? A bit of a rounder, let's say. He was a rogue. He was not easy to be around at times. Genius can be difficult to live with, particularly when he got into the cups. So yeah, I think there are quite a few parallels between Robert Johnson and Brian Jones.
And he had a mysterious passing. I mean, according to legend or the story, is he drowned mysteriously in a pool, right?
He was living. He got out of London. He was being harassed by the police. According to one story, there's two sides of the story. Then there's the truth, perhaps. But according to one story, the police had it out for Brian Jones. Well, they had it out for all of these long-haired musicians. They didn't like the influence. The establishment didn't like the influence these young upstarts from London were having on their children. And so they had it in for them a little bit. So according to the one story, Brian Jones, they planted drugs. The police planted drugs. And so he had a criminal record. And so he decided to get out of London. He was also being squeezed out of the Rolling Stones, primarily because he wasn't a songwriter. And that's the way the industry was moving. It was fine in the early days. The Rolling Stones were primarily a cover band, and what a cover band they were. I mean, they sort of reimagined, Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Muddy Waters and all of these great African-American artists. And so that was fine to a certain point. But then it was decided that you had to write your own music. You had to have a lyricist and a composer. Brian Jones was neither of those things, unfortunately. So he was being marginalized. So he got out of London and moved to the estate of the great British writer A.A. Milne, who wrote, of course, the Winnie the Pooh books, created these wonderful characters, Christopher Robin and so forth. And so he bought that house and was visited by the Rolling Stones co-founders, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, in late June, I believe, to tell Brian that he was out of the band, primarily because they were getting ready to embark on a North American tour. And because of Brian's drug record, he couldn't get a visa. So he was of no use to them, aside from the fact that, again, he was heavy into the cups and pills. And even when he showed up, which was rare in the latter stages at the recording studio, he would take 3 hours to restring his guitar. Sometimes the recording engineers were instructed not even to bother plugging his guitar into the amp because they were just trying to keep him busy and go through the motions. Brian was of no further use to the Rolling Stones. So Mick and Keith make their way down to Sussex, to Cotchford Farm, and tell Brian, that's it, you're out of the band. And he just sort of spiraled down from there. He took it all in stride. He supposedly had it in mind that he was going to form some super group after he got the boot. He was going to team up with Eric Clapton and John Lennon and maybe Jimi Hendrix and form this super band. Of course, it never came to fruition. He had performed on stage for the last time, months and months earlier. So he's in this downward spiral. The night of July 3rd, he's got quite an ensemble of people gathered around him, including, current girlfriends, former girlfriends, hangers-on, a nurse who was there primarily to keep Brian company because he absolutely hated being alone. There was also this crew of tradesmen who he just never could get rid of. They were constantly at the house. He had hired them to renovate Cotchford Farm. But these individuals were they were on a grift. They were looking to take as much money from Brian Jones as they could. They saw what fragile state he was in, that he was rarely sober, and they wouldn't leave, and they were constantly arguing. And the head of that crew was a guy by the name of Frank Thorogood, and he and Brian got into some titanic verbal arguments. There were times when it looked like it was going to come to fisticuffs. Perhaps it did on this particular night, and it was a cover-up. But yes, Brian was found underneath the diving board at the deep end of the swimming pool, in the fetal position. And there was one of the themes in the book, I think, particularly section 3, which is called Killer Riffs. And I reinvestigate the deaths of Brian and Jimi Hendrix and Elvis and Kurt Cobain. One of the common threads here is this rush to judgment. You can just imagine the police sort of, checking off the boxes. Rock musician, given to drink and drugs. Yeah, that's, accidental drowning, or in this case, death by misadventure. That was the official cause of death. Death by misadventure, accidental drowning. A lot of loose threads, shall we say. Frank Thorogood, I mentioned, the head of this crew, who was kind of a volatile individual. Allegedly, there's no public record of this, but allegedly, people who were surrounding him on his deathbed claim that he confessed to getting into a fight with Brian that night. Whether he held him around the neck a little too hard, whether he held him under the water, whether he struck him, and Brian fell into the water, we're not really sure. It's a little vague. It's kind of lost now in the mists of time. Whether Thorogood was being genuine, whether the people that are recounting this alleged deathbed confession are being honest, we don't know, but that's floating out there. We also know that there was another kind of shady character on the scene that night. His name was Tom Keelock. Tom Keelock was the fixer for the Rolling Stones. Most celebrities and big stars and musicians have a fixer. If something goes wrong, if there's scandal, they have a fixer to strong arm a newspaper reporter to make sure the story goes in a certain narrative and so forth. That was Tom Keelock, but he also was kind of a jack of all trades and he did lots of things. Well, again, a bit of a grifter. Keith Richards figured him out at a certain point that he was skimming and told him to hit the road. So Tom Keelock decides to head on down to Cotchford Farm and attach himself like a lamprey eel to Brian Jones and maybe see if he can, squeeze some more blood from a stone. No pun intended. And Tom Keelock was there that night, acting very suspicious when they finally pulled Brian Jones from the water, and he was laid out on the pool deck for hours and hours. In fact, I think it was almost daybreak by the time the ambulance got there to take his body away. There was Tom Keelock, burning Brian's clothes and some of his personal effects in a bonfire. Now, it gets even stranger because Tom Keelock's brother, Frank Keelock, was a detective with Scotland Yard. And it is also claimed by a number of researchers, Jeffrey Giuliano and fine gentleman from the Netherlands who co-authored a book with Terry Rawlings on Who Murdered Christopher Robin, sort of a take on A.A. Milne and Brian Jones living there. He says that there was an undercover policeman at Cotchford Farm that night and for some time. Whether he had hidden in and amongst the workers, we're not sure, but that may explain this cover-up. If there was, for example, manslaughter, if manslaughter was involved, or murder in the second degree, or first-degree murder, and it had gone to trial, all of those witnesses would have been subpoenaed and had to testify in court. Meanwhile, you've got this undercover cop there. We don't know why he was there. Was he looking for drugs? Was he spying on Brian Jones? We're not really sure. But that may have been the reason they had to cover up this death, because it had gone to court. This undercover cop would have been unveiled, as it were. One more thing that's very strange about this case, and that is that in an accidental drowning such as this, the autopsy would have been handled by the local medical examiner. At least that's what they're called in the United States. I don't know what they call them in Great Britain. So it would have been a medical examiner from Sussex, where Cotchford Farm was located, but it wasn't. In fact, the person who performed the autopsy and quickly announced or pronounced that it was death by misadventure was none other than the personal physician of the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, Harold Wilson. So that's how high up the ladder this alleged cover-up goes. Why would the Prime Minister appoint his own personal physician to handle the autopsy? Does it have something to do with the undercover policeman that was on the scene? Was Tom Keylock, the Rolling Stones fixer, was he relying on his brother at Scotland Yard, Frank Keylock, to help cover this up? We may never know at this point. It's been nearly 60 years after all.
But it's one of those eerie enigmas that surround these rock and roll stars is that they're surrounded by a lot of lampreys, like you said, and strange people who don't like their politics or their cultural influence. I mean, it's the same old tale, like Elvis and all these other people. They're seen as culturally degrading or something
Mhm.
like that. So you see that same theme with all these early deaths and things. Like I err on the side, and I saw that you had the great Cyril Weck was also investigated the Jones death, and he had his own. I mean, I think his analysis is correct. Like he could have just swam to the corner of the pool, whatever he had. Right? It's not that hard. And
Precisely. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah, it was Brian Jones was asthmatic, so it was speculated. Well, he had an asthma attack. What is it? One stroke to either side of the pool, or you grab onto the diving board. But Bill Wyman, a former Rolling Stones bassist, now retired, of course, um, tells a story in the book of being on tour with the Rolling Stones, and he was of all the Stones, he was closest to Brian Jones. To this day, he's very upset at the way that Jones, who was really the heart and soul, the founder of the band, he gave the band the name, the Rolling Stones. All of the swagger, all of the fancy clothes that Mick Jagger has sort of taken that mantle on. That was all Brian Jones. But you can't have the guitarist as the front and center, as the flamboyant one. It has to be the lead singer, right, in a rock and roll band. So, but Bill Wyman tells the story of touring with the band in Australia, and they went down to the beach. I think they were in Sydney, and the waves were particularly rough. Nobody wanted to go in the water except Brian Jones. He had no fear of the water. He was an incredibly strong swimmer. He swam on the high school swim team. He was a great diver. So it's very questionable as to whether even in the throes of an asthma attack that he would just simply sink and wind up in the fetal position, looking very calm, almost like he'd fallen asleep at the bottom of the pool.
yeah, it's very strange, super suspicious. And much like these other, but the story that came out is accidental drowning, death by misadventure. That's what the public understood. At least that's the public story. Much like Hendrix, who supposedly just took too many sleeping pills and died. Right? Like that's the cover story. There's nobody really questioned that publicly, as far as I know.
That's right. Well, the so he's in Notting Hill, a very nice neighborhood in London, and he's staying at this Samarkand hotel with his girlfriend and Monica Danneman, and he's getting ready to leave and perform at the Isle of Wight music festival. Of course, he doesn't make it there. It's on September 18th, 1970. He allegedly takes a handful of barbiturates and drinks a lot of red wine, and that cocktail causes him to aspirate on his own vomit. Basically, dies of asphyxia. That's the official story. Monica Danneman wakes up, finds him unresponsive, calls an ambulance. They cart him away to St. Mary's Abbot Hospital in London, and the attending physician, who went on the record almost immediately. This again is in the early hours after this event in September of 1970, and remarked how Jimi Hendrix, and they tried for I think half an hour to revive him, but he was gone. His hair was soaked in red wine. His clothes were soaked in red wine. His lungs were filled with red wine. Uh, no red wine in his stomach, which is odd. It was as if he had been drowned in red wine. So this physician put that out there, but it just, for whatever reason, never gained traction, or was, people were encouraged to look the other way. That's a conspiracy theory. He was a rock star. He was a drug taker. What else do you need to know? Move along. Nothing to see here, folks.
Of the maybe the second greatest guitarist of all time, next to Robert Johnson, or maybe the first. I don't know. I think he's considered the greatest rock guitarist of all time. So, but like, it's an open and shut case of like this incredible talent who
Uh,
went on to have could have had a great life of luxury and fame and fortune.
yeah, he was just beginning to take off. Like just blaring across, or flaring across the sky like a comet. He'd only really come on the scene maybe 4 years earlier, discovered in Greenwich Village at the Cafe Wah by Chaz Chandler, who was the bass player for the Animals, Eric Burdon and the Animals. Eric Burdon also looms large in this chapter. We can get into that if you'd like in a moment. But
That's the guy who sang "House of the Rising Sun," right?
that's right. That's right. And Chaz Chandler discovered him at Cafe Wah. He called his buddy, who was also the road manager for the Animals and would later become the road manager for Ike and Tina Turner, and Jimi Hendrix. And his name was James Tappy Wright, who I interviewed for the podcast, and he's in the book as well. He's since passed on a couple of years after I interviewed him. But Chaz asked Tappy Wright to come down to the Cafe Wah to check out Jimi Hendrix, and they both agreed, this guy's got the royal jelly. So they took him to London. They figured he's going to make it big in England first, which he did, and then he came back to the United States, and he got saddled up with a very shadowy figure. Where have we heard that word before? A shadowy figure, and his name was Mike Jeffrey. He became his manager, and Mike Jeffrey was former British intelligence, whether he was MI5 or MI6, not 100% sure. It is said that he served in British intelligence during the Suez Crisis in 1956. He would tell anybody, once he got into the cups, loose lips, he would tell people about his time in intelligence, and how he was one of those guys who would tell you, I can kill you with my baby finger. And people believed him. He was kind of a sinister guy. He had a reputation. James Tappy Wright was friends with Mike Jeffrey, but he said at the same time he was afraid of him. A lot of people were afraid of him. Jimmy was afraid of him. And he was kind of like a Svengali or a Rasputin. He had Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy was like wrapped around his finger. And he was afraid to leave him. He was afraid what would happen if he left him. But at the same time, it was kind of an abusive kind of relationship, because Mike Jeffrey would tour Jimi Hendrix nonstop. He would just grind him into the ground, and Jimmy didn't know whether he was coming or going. And if you look at some of his tour schedules, they were very strange. Like, there wasn't any pattern. You would think, okay, we're gonna tour in New York, and then maybe we'll go up to Buffalo, and then we'll go over to Cleveland, and we'll work our way into the Midwest. And then he was all over the map, as if Mike Jeffrey was deliberately trying to tire him, to exhaust him with travel and nonstop touring, and Jim and people around Jimmy, were trying to get Jimmy's attention, like Juma Sultan, who played, who was a percussionist, who played with Jimmy's last band at Woodstock, Gypsy Sons and Rainbows, I think the name of the band. He wasn't with the Jimi Hendrix experience when he performed at Woodstock. They were finished, but Juma Sultan, who's in the book, said, they tried to pull Jimmy aside and tell him, Mike Jeffrey, man, he's no good for you. It was almost like he was performing MK Ultra type mind control on Jimmy. There was a very famous story of Jimmy performing in New York, and after the um, performance, he was kind of lured away by someone with a promise of some of the best cocaine in town, and um, instead of finding his score, he ended up in the back of a van, was whisked away to an apartment. He was held hostage. He was kidnapped, and um, it later turned out that that kidnapping was arranged by Mike Jeffrey. So Jimi Hendrix is being held by these mobsters in an apartment somewhere on in Manhattan. Meanwhile, Mike Jeffrey arranges with one of his buddies who knows some wise guys in New Jersey, and they're sent to this apartment. Miraculously, they knew exactly where Jimmy was being held, and the crew of mobsters from New Jersey freed Jimi Hendrix from the clutches of these New York mobsters. And Mike Jeffrey rides in like the knight on in shining armor, and looks like he's the hero for rescuing Jimi Hendrix. Jimmy later learned, and Tappy tells the story, that Mike Jeffrey arranged for that kidnapping, so that again Jimmy would feel entirely dependent on Mike Jeffrey for his safety and his well-being. There was another incident where Jimi Hendrix flew into Toronto here. This would have been, I think, in early 1970. The Border and Customs people found drug paraphernalia in his luggage. Now, at this time, Jimi Hendrix claimed, and I believe this is the case, that he was clean. He was no longer taking heroin. He turned to his girlfriend at the time, Kathy Etchingham, and looking totally bewildered when they found the drug paraphernalia in his luggage, and said, I've been clean. I didn't put this here. Again, in swoops Mike Jeffrey. Now, keeping in mind, 1970 in Canada, you get busted like that, you could be looking at a fairly lengthy prison sentence. Mike Jeffrey, perhaps with his intelligence connections, was able to get Jimi Hendrix off scot-free. And again, Mike Jeffrey, looking very much like the hero. And he would say things like this to Jimmy: Jimmy, without me, you're lost. You're going to be thrown to the wolves. Mike Jeffrey did this perhaps because he knew his contract with Jimmy was expiring. In fact, it was going to expire, I believe, at the end of 1970. And Jimi Hendrix was Mike Jeffrey's cash cow. He may have been, if he wasn't his only client, he was certainly his most important client by a long shot. And Mike Jeffrey was indebted to the mob. He owed them a lot of money. And without Jimi Hendrix, he would have been in big trouble. So is that the motive? Perhaps.
There's so many stories about these guys, these artists getting entangles with their promoters or their producers, and then ending up, unfortunately, mysteriously dead. It's actually crazy how many stories there are where they're having negotiations with their producers and then things go awry. So it's
it's almost the rule and not the exception. I mean, I when you look at the history of rock music from, let's say, I don't know, the starting off in the mid 1950s, and it probably predates this with other genres of music, but the record industry, it seems, has always been like the Wild West. And you have some very unscrupulous people. You had record labels that were run by essentially mobsters. There's a celebrated story of, I think it was Maverick Records. I did the Bobby Fuller story, Bobby Fuller and the Fuller Five, for the podcast, but it didn't make it into this book. Maybe there'll be a volume 2. But the owner of Maverick Records was just known for shaking artists down. In fact, if you didn't get his way, he would hold you over the balcony, from the 4th or 5th story by the legs.
Like Death Row Records. Death Row Records did the same thing.
Yeah, until he got his way. So, the record producers, the A&R people, the owners, I mean, it goes on to this day. You talk to people who got out of the industry, if they got out with their life, and they tell a lot of the same stories. It's how they were used and abused, and everything was taken from them and stolen, and they ended up with nothing or a small fraction of what they deserved. And that was certainly the case with Bobby Fuller.
Yeah,
Also the
Fuller
case,
ended up what, dead in flames in Hollywood, and like right in the center of Hollywood, right off Hollywood Boulevard, if I remember
they
correctly.
they did. They found his partially burned body in the back seat of his car in the parking lot of the hotel where he was staying with his mother and brother, I believe. And get this, it was ruled a drug overdose. Um,
So you
excuse
see
me,
these
his
shady medical examiners show up everywhere in these deaths, almost like they're put into place to affirm whatever was going on.
again.
It's
That's
so
another
strange.
common
Yeah,
thread.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Hendrix, I've like nobody, people believed that there was that cover story, but nobody believed it later on that he would actually OD or kill himself. Like I've heard stories like people shoved those sleeping pills down his throat. Like that
Yeah.
was the point. Yeah.
Well, Mike Jeffrey was familiar with a particular kind of torture. We now call it waterboarding, where let's imagine Brian Jones was, or sorry, Jimi Hendrix was given these barbiturates. Um, there's some indication that they were given to him by Monica Dannemann. These were a German type of barbiturate. That's an allegation, never been proven. Monica Dannemann no longer with us, but so that these barbiturates basically left Jimmy in a very sort of subdued and vulnerable state. And then whether Mike Jeffrey was there that night, we're not sure. Whether he had hired goons come in and basically hold Jimmy down uh, and pour the red wine maybe down his nose or down his throat. Again, think of waterboarding in a particular way, so that he essentially drowned. He essentially drowned. And I should point out again, with the motive, why would Mike Jeffrey kill his cash cow? Well, he had taken out a life insurance policy on Jimi Hendrix. Now, it was standard for record companies to take out insurance on their artists, but Mike Jeffrey also took out a life insurance policy on his client Jimi Hendrix.
Right. So there's the incentives and everything like that, and the
Yeah,
jealousy and somebody leaving. Like that's the same thing. I think Cobain was in like a very contentious contract debate with Geffen and his other bandmates too, right? Wasn't something like that?
I believe that's the case. Although with the Kurt Cobain story, um, all roads seem to lead to Courtney Love, his wife. Allegedly, reportedly, none of these are proven. They're allegations, never been proven in court.
Right. Pure
But
speculation. We're speculating right now.
yes, although there's some pretty compelling evidence. In fact, it's kind of timely. Just a few months ago, there was an independent forensic research team that petitioned the Seattle Police Department or the King County Medical Office to reopen the case. And a lot of the evidence that they put forward in this report is contained in my chapter on Kurt Cobain, which is called "The Needle, the Barrel, and the Lies." Kurt supposedly took his life by sticking a shotgun in his mouth, even though he had reportedly 3 times the lethal amount of heroin in his blood at the time, which would have rendered him unconscious. How he managed to stick the business end of a shotgun in his mouth. I've held a shotgun. I'm not a hunter, but I've held shotguns in my hand. It's a very cumbersome weapon. Think about the long barrel. Plus, to that long barrel, there was a flash suppressor attached to the weapon. That's another 6 inches.
Wow.
How does he turn that around, stick it in his mouth, and with his arm, manage to pull the trigger? Maybe if he had taken a shoe off, maybe he could reach it with his leg and his big toe, but both his shoes were on him when he died. So that whole story, just, I'm sorry, it stinks to high heaven.
Yeah, no, it's just another sketchy tale. Like it is the enigma. It is the eerie enigma of all these guys' lives. The interesting thing is like they've all met these strange deaths. They are so influential. All these guys who died young at 27, the Stones and Nirvana and Hendrix. He's got to be I think he's still one of the best-selling artists of today. Like it's like Bob Marley or something, who's another mysterious death. I don't know
Yeah.
if you read about it, but
Yeah, Marley. I talk about on the podcast. I dedicated an episode to the CIA and their interest in Jamaica at that time. They were concerned about Jamaica falling into the communist the clutches of communist Cuba or maybe even the Soviet Union. They had a left leaning prime minister at the time. Um, Bob Marley tried to sort of walk that tightrope, to be apolitical. He didn't want to be associated with the left or the right, but both sides tried to use him for their to furtherance of their causes, and there was a perception that Bob Marley was maybe, um, I believe it was Prime Minister Manley at the time, that he was simpatico with the left-leaning Manley. The CIA couldn't tolerate that. Were they perhaps involved in his death, um, or at least in an assassination attempt that nearly cost um, Marley his life? It's in the on the podcast. Didn't make it into the book. If I could just very quickly, I just before I forget, at the end of each chapter is a QR code, and you can listen to the episode of the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone podcast that inspired that chapter. The podcast currently not available anywhere at the moment. There is no platform where you can find it. But if you get the book, the QR code is there, and you can listen to the actual podcast episode. Thank you. I just wanted to
Yeah,
mention
no,
that.
it's really cool. It's a really cool element of your book. I haven't seen it like that. There's one other book I saw that had that QR code, but your QR code goes to an audio instead of like another segment of the book or something online. So
Right.
people can check that out. It's a very well crafted book. The fit and finish is really nice too.
Thank you.
With a lot of like pictures and stuff as well. We are at the 51-minute mark. It's passed very quick. There's so much more information in this book, guys. There's a whole section about the Beatles, Leonard Skinner, more on Altamont, which is a story in and of itself. There's just a lot of great lore and how strange the rock and roll world has been. Really, the kind of some of the unknown history is memorialized in this book. Do you have time for a few questions and comments,
I
Richard?
would love it. I would welcome
Great,
it. Thank you, William.
great. Here we go. Let's see. All American Man ask Eric about Eric Burden knowing Hendrix was murdered. Did Eric Burden think he was murdered right away?
Initially, Eric Burden, I should point out, Monica Danneman, her girlfriend was dating Eric Burden at the time. And at the time of Jimi Hendrix's death, Eric Burden and his girlfriend were also in London. So after calling the ambulance, or maybe even before she called the ambulance, her first or second call was to Eric Burden and asked him to come over and sort of help maybe clean things up a little bit, whatever that means. Now, Eric Burden found what he thought was a suicide note, and he told reporters almost immediately after Jimmy was pronounced dead that he believed Jimmy had committed suicide. That caused quite a furor because that would have invalidated the life insurance policies from the record company, and we're talking millions of dollars. Mike Jeffrey wouldn't have been too happy about that either, since he also had a life insurance policy. And if you have, if there's a suicide, that invalidates the life insurance policy. Eric Burden backtracked very quickly, but he should have anyway, because he quickly realized that what he found was not a suicide note, and this has some parallels with Kurt Cobain as well. What he found was Jimmy sort of noodling, maybe writing some song lyrics, talking sort of or writing very metaphysically, and Eric, in a rush to judgment, sort of assumed that it was Jimmy saying goodbye. It wasn't the case. It wasn't a suicide note, and Eric had to sort of do a 180 and go on the record and say, no, I was mistaken. It wasn't a suicide.
Yeah, and my understanding is Hendrix not only was a great musician, but he was his own lyricist. So a lot of those lyrics were his, my understanding. So
Yes, yeah, he
would
was
make sense.
terrific. I think he was a terrific lyricist. I don't think he gets the credit
I
for
think you're
that.
right. I think you're right. He's just a creative genius. Rodney Adderton says, I ordered this book over a month ago. Won't be long now. Hello, Richard. You are the best. So
Oh,
you have a
thank you. God
fan.
bless you.
Neighbor of mine, Pamela, says knew Jimmy. She says the sweetest man. He did not OD. He didn't take that drug. She was still angry those years later. So no. Council Estate asks, what about Bonham? Accident or red rum? Do you have any comments on that?
I don't get into John's death except in a chapter on Aleister Crowley, which is, I know, a subject near and dear to you, William, but I focus mainly on Jimmy Page's obsession with Aleister Crowley, the Crowley's selection of Boleskine House on the remote shores of Loch Ness to perform his Abramelin operation, this occult ritual to summon, perhaps, well, he wouldn't have called them demons, but I sort of see things through a biblical lens. I would call them demons, and he didn't properly bind these entities, and he was suddenly called off to Paris, and so strange things started happening at Boleskine House. Very peaceful people suddenly going on a drunken rampage and murdering people. Along several decades later, along comes Jimmy Page and buys the home. He's absolutely obsessed with Crowley, collected all of his works, opened a bookstore in London dedicated to Aleister Crowley. He sort of cajoled the rest of the band, minus John Paul Jones, who took a pass, but he summoned Robert Plant and John Bonham to the house, Boleskine House, and they made a pact, perhaps, or a ritual. They were all assigned sigils, and then, of course, we know the horrible string of misfortune that befell the band, including Robert Plant's near-fatal car accident while on vacation in Greece, the death of his baby son, which is horrible, Carrick, Jimmy Page becoming almost a hopeless heroin addict for a time, and of course, culminating with the death of John Bonham in 1980. I don't get into the specifics of John Bonham's death, however.
It's a tragic death. He drank a lot. They were around. He died while the band members were around. They just didn't, when somebody wasn't just watching him sleep, I think is my understanding. Image 30 asks, what level was Hendrix's involvement with the occult or magic or whatever? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't. I didn't explore that so much as focused on his death. A lot of musicians sort of dabbled in it, and for many, I mean, even Aleister Crowley. I mean, you can correct me. You know far more about Crowley than I do. I mean, I think he played around. He loved that the images, the world's most dangerous man, and the beast, and so forth. I think he reveled in that. I don't think he really paid too much attention to Christianity. I don't think he saw himself as a Satanist. Again, from a Christian's perspective, they would say, yes, he was. But a lot of these people dabbled in the occult. Maybe it was for marketing purposes or branding. You've got to, Ozzy Osbourne, I think, is a classic example in Black Sabbath. Ozzy Osbourne was not a Satanist, or so he said. But it was just the thing to do in rock and roll. If you're going to be anti-establishment, you got to put the image of Baphomet on your album. That's going to sell, to the kids, because they want to give the big finger to anything establishment, including the church. But I contend that even if you're not necessarily being sincere in your beliefs, it remains an invitation. I believe in an unseen world, and when you invite certain things into your life, even if you're being tongue in cheek about it, I think it can be a dangerous thing.
I agree. Lizzie asks, Richard, do you have any insights into the tragedy of Badfinger? Those guys got screwed so badly. Do you have any thoughts on that?
If I haven't covered them in the book or in the podcast, but again, just an incredible streak of misfortune. I believe, is it 2 members or 3 committed suicide?
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow. Council Estate, hang on, I need to get a pen and write it all down. The good news is you can just buy the book, Council Estate. It's available tomorrow. You can do it. And then Lizzie follows up with, what about Michael Hutchins? Do you know anything about his?
In Excess. Again, I believe that was another tragic suicide with Michael Hutchins in Excess. Yeah, there's so many stories. Even though I covered 40 on the podcast, I didn't even scratch the surface. So, that'd be another great one to look into. Sorry, I can't offer any more.
Yeah, there's a lot of information in this book we did not cover, and it is available. Is there anything you'd like to, we're at the hour mark? Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
Well, the book is dedicated to my late collaborator and partner, R. Gary Patterson, who died coincidentally on the 50th anniversary of the release of Sgt. Pepper, May 17th, 2017. The album was released in the UK on May 17th, 1967. But I'm sorry, May 26th. My apologies. But the last chapter in the book is about the last phone call I had with R. Gary Patterson. And it takes on kind of a supernatural, paranormal tone. And if people read the book, they'll find out why. But it's a phone call. A week doesn't go by I don't think about it, even though it's been nearly 10 years. I am conflicted by it. I don't pretend, to know for certain what happened. But let me just leave you with this. I hate it when people say, well, you'll have to buy the book to find out. I'm going to give you this. R. Gary Patterson and I talked on the phone. It was late spring. It doesn't get dark up here until about 8:30 at that time of year. It was pitch black out. I'm guessing it was well after 9 o'clock. Later, I found out Gary passed away that very same day at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wow, that's amazing. I've heard stories of that, like people who passed on contacting people right away or something, either through a dream or some kind of signal they felt like something happened. There was some kind of reaching out. So
This was a
really
lengthy phone call, and we had a lengthy conversation, and I wandered around the house with my phone to my ear, and looking back, the whole thing is very surreal. I was like drifting from room to room, almost like I was in a dream state. When I found out the next morning that he had died, I rushed upstairs. My wife, the mighty Aphrodite I call her, was just getting out of bed. And without me prompting her, she saw there was something wrong. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I just found out Gary died." And without me prompting her, it's kind of confirmation. She said, "You were just talking to him last night." And I said, "I thought so." I looked on my phone, on my recents. There was no incoming call from Gary or anybody. I didn't talk to anybody on the phone that day. No ingoing or outgoing calls. And yet she remembered me being on the phone. I remembered me being on the phone. Are we both misremembering things? Hey, I don't pretend, to know the answer. It's all possible, but it's as best as I can remember. I talked to R. Gary Patterson probably at least 3 or 4 hours after he passed.
That's amazing. And he's written like 3 or 4 books, right? Hellhounds on Their Trail.
Yes.
Beatles.
He wrote the definitive sort of rebuttal for the Paul is Dead legend. It was called I Am the Paul was the Walrus, or no, the Walrus was Paul. That was sort of the seminal book on the whole Paul is Dead legend, which I also cover in the book. He was a fond of information. I miss him.
Yeah, sorry for your loss, but that's still debatable. People are still talking about Paul is dead or Paul falls, the switch, and the change in the Beatles. So you've got a whole quarter of the book on that we didn't even glance into. So people can check out your research on that. And where can they find Richard Syrett's Strange Planet?
Strangeplanet.ca. We've got a funny URL up here, not .com, it's .ca, strangeplanet.ca. The podcast drops 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The YouTube channel at Strange Planet Radio. You can go to the website, stream the podcast, sign up, become a premium subscriber, subscribe to the free monthly newsletter, which comes right to your email inbox. It's called Inner Sanctum, and we do some pretty deep dives into the subterranean world, if you will. So it's all
there's
there.
Your social media links right there. So is that the best place to find out you on YouTube and Instagram, etc.?
That's it.
And
yes.
If people want to follow up with you, that's the best place to contact you is through your website.
That's right. And they can also find my upcoming appearances on Coast to Coast AM.
Gotcha. So they can check it out there. Well, thanks so much for your time. Guys, there's so much more information in this book. Check it out. It's very well written. And also you can take those links to listen to the podcasts and get a kind of deeper understanding of a lot of the stories he tells in this book. And the full title, again, is Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, Eerie Enigmas and Supernatural Secrets from Rock's Darkest Corners. And it will be available you can purchase it now, but it will be up on July 9th in paperback right now. But I'm assuming that you'll have different versions sometime in the future. Is that correct? Or is it only paperback?
I'm so new to this game. I don't know exactly how it works, but I know that people like the audio of books as well. They're becoming very popular. So there may well be an audio book in the near future, and I guess a Kindle version. I'm not sure
Yeah.
exactly how that's done.
Try and Day will take care of it for you.
Yes, they're
Probably.
great.
I would assume that they will have something else, but you can get the paperback now. You can be seen walking around with this new book, guys. Check it out. Again, it's Tales from the Rock and Roll Twilight Zone, and again, it's Richard Syrett, Syrett, and the podcast is Strange Planet. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, William, thank you for having me.
Yeah, great job. Okay.